Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is another City Talk conversation on the critical issues facing the next president. The children's song says, London Bridge is falling down. So are America's bridges. Its dams are leaking, its levees breached and broken, its water mains bursting, its roads crumbling, its transit systems collapsing. It's the infrastructure, stupid. Here to talk about the infrastructure crisis in the United States, what's wrong, what needs to be done, and how to pay for it, is Robert Buzz Paaswell. Dr. Paaswell is a distinguished professor of civil engineering at City College and the director of the University Transportation Research Center, a federally funded center that provides research and training to transportation professionals. Professor Paaswell serves on numerous commissions and task forces, including the MTA Blue Ribbon Commission on Workforce Development and the Governor's Commission on Higher Education. He is also a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Welcome back, Buzz.
Good morning. Good
morning.
That
introduction, please. Okay. It seems to me, reading this material and sort of looking at public policy, infrastructure is probably the most neglected field of public policy, no?
Absolutely.
And we only seem to pay attention to it when there's a catastrophe, you know. I-35W collapses, or the concrete falls from the Big Dig, or you have Katrina, or you have the blackout in the Northeast in 2003. Why is it that we don't respond unless there's a tragic catastrophe?
Well, the symptoms are there. The symptoms have been there a long time. And probably the best symptom that we can talk about is congestion. Any of us who drive on our highways, and those people who live in suburbs know that Saturday afternoon congestion going to the shopping mall is probably the worst traffic.
Forget it. This morning getting in for this interview on Route 3, forget it.
Well, you should live in Manhattan close to the studio and walk, and that would be one of the solutions to the problem.
Thank you very much.
But let's trace it back. The bulk of our infrastructure was probably built of our modern infrastructure. The infrastructure has been around for a couple of hundred years. The nation was built on mobility, horse trails, and then water, and then the railroads. And the railroads, of course, are a situation in themselves. The golden age of the railroads was before World War I, and then we began to disinvest in the railroads. This country did, leaving it up to that. But the infrastructure that most of us are familiar with, and the bridge crisis in Minneapolis is an example of that. Was built from after the Depression, when Roosevelt invested tremendous amounts of money in public works, until probably the late 70s. The big impetus to our infrastructure came from 1956 on, when Eisenhower proposed that we begin to build large-scale interstate highways, what we know as the interstate system now, that connect all the major urban areas in the United States. Now, Eisenhower, to sell that, the irony, of course, is to sell that, he didn't sell that as just increasing mobility. He sold that as a defense set of highways where we could move tanks from city to city in case of World War III. But he was a brilliant person and felt that we really needed this for economics and commerce. But if we think the population of the United States in the 50s was around 150 million, and it's more than double that now. So, and if we assume that every 4 people represent a household, probably less than that, and every household now in the United States has at least 1 car, that's accounting, on average, that's accounting for the households that don't have any cars, usually among the lowest income, or people who live in Manhattan, and many people have 2 or 3 cars. And you do the math, you see we have a lot of vehicles in the United States. The highways were designed, and as a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers and a proud civil engineer, we did a tremendous job. We designed and built our highways for what we anticipated to be the loads and volumes of vehicles that would be going over them from 50 to 70 to 80. And in most of the highways in the United States, these loads, the volumes of traffic were exceeded much sooner than their design lives. The design lives are usually 20 to 30 years. And the loads, the trucks were bigger, the cars were bigger, so that the loads on the highways too, so the highways began to deteriorate. Now, part of the problem stems from we'll go sort of from engineering and good construction to maintenance and funding. Part of the problem stems from the fact that when we built our infrastructure, the tremendous amount of money that poured out between let's say 1955 and 1980, and the money was primarily funded by user fees, gasoline taxes into the Highway Trust Fund, which are running out, and that's one of the symptoms that we see now. That was for the capital. That was for building the system. And it was cheap capital. The interstate system was built on 90-10 money. In other words, if the state has $10, the feds would give them 90. Yep. It's a great thing. Sure. And in fact, if you had a transit system and a railroad competing, and you had $9 for one, and the others got either no funding or very little funding, it's easy to see where, as a congressman or a senator, you would put your money. Sure. So the highway system was built and built very well. But all of a sudden, the state DOTs found that as these lives ran out, that, hey, it costs a lot of money to maintain these things. And the maintenance money comes from local funds. And we know in New York City, deferred maintenance is death, sometimes literally. Well, absolutely. You know, as with anything, you know, I always like to make the analogy between owning people who own their house or people who rent their houses and our infrastructure. If you don't do anything, it's going to wear out. So if you have a house and, you know, the light bulbs begin to flicker and you really should begin to change your wires, or the plumbing isn't working right, you should change the plumbing, because, you know, if you don't, you're going to have a real catastrophe in a year or so. Right. Well, that's what's happened with our highways. We haven't been able to maintain them, or we defer the maintenance, or we're not able to maintain them at the level we want, basically because we haven't been able to fund it at the same levels that we were able to fund our capital. Okay, and you're talking about mainly about highways and transportation, but the American Society of Civil Engineers has 15 categories, from aviation, bridges, and dams to solid waste, transit, and wastewater. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about all the physical plant, and according to the ASCE, the society, that you've got an overall grade of D, right, and it's going to cost, they estimated in 2005, $1.6 trillion. Right. Excuse me. So what are the priorities? I mean, among these 16, I mean, you have to deal with all of it. Here's the issue. The American Society of Civil Engineers is talking about what we call life support systems. These are the systems. It's certainly more glamorous to build a large building and move into it, or see development take place, or see a new transit-oriented design, to see a suburb grow up around a transit station. Mayors like to open those things. Mayors don't necessarily like to open relaying a water pipe, or putting up some new strands of electric wire or something. In fact, when the electric companies begin to say we need to generate more supply, this is a big issue. It's not just highways, but it's in energy in the United States. Sure. And a lot of our energy for the life of our city. Certainly, we know that we use oil and petroleum-based fuels for the mobility, but for the life of our cities, we use electricity, and that's where you have your dams for hydro, sure, where you have it, or in places like New York, it's oil-based, right, coal-based, right, fuel, and in one or two places, nuclear power. But they have to, electric systems have to be maintained just as highways have to be maintained, and those are very expensive to maintain. And as you add people, let me just interrupt for a second. How many times has the grid broken down? Because the grid was designed for X millions of people, and all of a sudden we see we have X plus double X. 100 or 200 more million people. So that you need to build new capacity. New capacity costs a lot of money, and there's two problems with that. One is to build new capacity, you have to charge electric users higher rates, so you generate the capital to basically support bonds. They issue bonds. But where are you going to build it? People don't want to see electric power stations built near them. Particularly nuclear power. Yeah, or any kind. Right. Any kind. That's when they wanted to build temporary power generation. When Con Ed wanted to build it, I guess in the shores of Brooklyn or around there, there was a lot of resistance from the neighborhoods. We don't want generation stations near us. Right. The sense that maybe the flux coming from that would cause problems. So it's interesting. We've reached, I think, from a planning perspective, we've reached an interesting point in our society where people got used to this incredible amount of infrastructure that we put in this country from 1950 to the year 2000. Okay. Come the year 2000, we want to sustain our infrastructure, but we really don't want to pay for it. A good example is a fight that Governor Corzine is having in New Jersey. New Jersey is congested, no question about it.
Tell me.
They have incredible infrastructure, starting with the Port of New Jersey. That's a piece of infrastructure that's critical to the region. Fortunately, it's run by a separate state authority, the Port Authority, who can, through its revenues and the issuance of bonds and through the tolls it gets on its bridges, is self-sufficient. But that's for a very unique, enclosed.
But also, I mean, in terms of the port in New York, you need a lot of work and a lot of money to maintain the competitiveness.
Well, they have to dredge it, make it larger, build an offshore port for the next generation of vehicles.
Is that going to happen? No.
No, it will happen.
Oh, it will.
It has to happen. The port has to. There are basically two large ports in the United States. One is on the West Coast, Los Angeles, Long Beach, probably two ports over there, and the other is the Port of New York and New Jersey. You hear about Charleston and Montreal and Houston and Port Everglades, and those are all smaller ports, but those aren't the major entry ports for the huge amount of commerce that's coming from Europe and Asia. In fact, China is now shipping not only to the West Coast, but they're shipping, believe it or not, through the Port of New York. So the port's going to grow, but part of New Jersey's problem comes from the fact that here's the port, and then you have to have this infrastructure connecting the port. Right. It's both rail and highways.
Arterial highway.
And how are you going to improve the Garden State, the New Jersey Turnpike? How are you going to address trucks and cars? How are you going to address the balance between rail and trucks? These are all big issues that require a tremendous amount of investment. Governor Corzine
and political will.
And political will. But the political will, if you have political will and the voters don't like what you do, you're out and your political will isn't worth anything. So Governor Corzine is facing a lot of problems now because people don't like the fact that he's floated one kind of tax or one kind of toll after another. Yet the people in New Jersey will tell you it's congested. I want somebody to do something about it.
But you don't expect logic and proportion. Come on.
But that's a national national habit.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
So, suppose if we don't do anything, what happens?
Well, that's what's happening now. And we're not building at the rate that the Europeans are building. We're certainly not building at the rate that the Asians are building, whether it's in China or in India now, where they're building roads in India, and railroads, building railroads. We're certainly not building railroads in this country, which is something that's needed. We have no long-term strategic plan for investment in infrastructure. None at all in this country.
McCain and Obama, any hope?
Well, I think both of them recognize it. Both of them hint at the fact that you need infrastructure. Senator Obama has suggested that we support this infrastructure bank.
We'll talk about that.
Hagel and Dodd, I guess, proposed something. That's part of the solution. I think McCain, I would guess, would support something like that, or support. He's talked in his campaign generally about investing in infrastructure. It's, as they say, where the rubber hits the road. But it's not quite as simple as that. Starting with the Reagan administration in 1980, there was a political philosophy that made a sharp divide from, let's say, the Roosevelt period on. Roosevelt period felt that the government should be interventionist and should invest in public works, and that the priming of the country with public works will keep jobs going and also help build our infrastructure, the dams, the WPA, the electricity in the South. All this came from that kind of an intervention.
And it's not only economic stimulus, but it's really national security.
Well, it's that too. I think, a healthy country is national security. I think that's the bottom line, is you can't have national security at the expense of quality of life. They go together, because what are you securing? The Reagan philosophy was a devolution philosophy, saying that the government really should not be the investor. The investment should go down to the local level, the states and local governments. Well, unfortunately, when you push everything back to states and local governments, you have a different sized bank, in a sense, to work with. State treasury is different from the federal treasury.
Types of depositors and taxpayers.
Absolutely. So what was once a national priority, and think of Eisenhower talked about the national interstate defense highway system, as he would call it, or the Federal Highway Administration being the repository for the federal aid highway system, or originally, just up through World War II, supporting our railroads. the tremendous and interesting, the irony, of course, is our airports at least have the value of federal investment in the generation of towers and of control.
Yeah, but you still have millions of hours
system.
of lost time on the, well,
right.
Planes are sitting on the tarmac.
Well, because not enough federal money then flows back to the airports because it's felt that this is all private, private in a sense. But if you begin to think of where we have to go with our infrastructure, it isn't just building our highways, but a number of us feel we have to revitalize railroads in the United States, both for freight and for high-speed rail. High-speed rail to address the fact that as we want to fly less, use airline fuel less, it might pay to have a high-speed electrified rail from rational city pairs, from Richmond up to Boston, for example, Boston to Chicago, through Buffalo, and the West Coast, and and in Texas to think of that. Not necessarily maglev or all these glamour things.
Which I was on in Shanghai, which is quite interesting.
It's great. But, rail that goes 150 miles an hour. Think of it from a New York perspective. If you could be in Albany in an hour and a half and you knew there was a train every hour or hour and a half, it would really change the Albany-New York nexus, and you'd begin to see...
someplace other than Albany. No, go ahead.
Well, New York, Washington in 2 hours instead of 2.5 hours. What it does is it just makes these more accessible. And I was thinking from a science point of view, Albany is now the home of nanotech. It's New York's answer to 21st century science, and it's a brilliant things going on there. And if the scientists in New York could just drop in nanotech instead of worrying they're going to have to fight for a seat on a train that's also going to Montreal and to the Adirondacks. Beautiful up there, but it's not the kind of train service you want.
Right.
So that you want to do that. But what that says is we have to balance our investment in our highways with our investment in rail. That's a strategic kind of issue. Now
you're talking, but you use the term scientific point of view. Talk about the politics. Is it at all likely that rail will get what you want for political reasons, regional reasons? Is this a Northeast thing, and the rest of the country doesn't want it?
It isn't a Northeast thing. Unfortunately, there's pressure for rail coming from Texas, where they want to link Houston and San Antonio and Dallas.
So you're talking about a much more widely distributed.
The whole the Midwest consortium was just Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit all the way up to Boston, down to New York, and then on the West Coast.
You're sanguine that this will happen?
I think that it's going to happen because there's enough pressure by enough diverse political interests, and it might be opportune now that we've reached a point in our economy where we really need public investment again.
We'll talk about that. Let's go to responses. And one of the responses was in California in 2006. Schwarzenegger had a $20 billion bond initiative. Is that feasible on a national or various state levels, this amount of bonding, which in a sense is almost a drop in the bucket anyway?
Well, New York always has billions of dollars of bonds outstanding for its infrastructure and for a variety, for water. You always hear about the MTA or transit infrastructure, but they also do it for water and for power. The power companies do that, and for sanitary stuff. Bonding is one way to go, and it's certainly been... other than getting grants, people issue bonds. That's been the 1950s on approach to, in a sense, pay as you go. The difficulty with bonding, of course, is bonds have interest, and the debt has to be repaid. So the question is, how do you repay that? In some instances, if you have a toll road, you pay the debt out of the revenues from the toll road.
Right.
If you're just going now to using bonding to pay for general purpose roads, then the money has to come out of the state treasury. That's taxes, no matter how you put it.
Right.
That's where the money comes from the state treasury. Right. It doesn't dribble in from any place. A number of people feel that we're going. I guess we're going to talk about the infrastructure bank, but a number of people feel that the feds can play a role in that too by federalizing some of this what's done at the state level, in a sense, issue debt or create the ability for states to finance as they go.
And clearly you have had in the last year Governor Schwarzenegger, Rendell of Pennsylvania, and Mayor Bloomberg putting together this Building America's Future, which deals with infrastructure. Let's talk about the infrastructure bank that you already alluded to and what it purports to do, what we might expect it to do.
Well, the infrastructure, the Hagel-Dodd proposal basically says that the feds will set up an infrastructure bank, maybe funded at $50 billion. Who knows what it's fake? But then it has a whole lot of categories, and if you read the bill, it says that for worthy projects, and they're talking about projects of about 50 or 75 million or more, for worthy projects that have been vetted. And that's the key word, vetted. Projects that
explain what is not happening now and what ought to happen with
we can have a little fun with this. If you want to talk about pork barrel, because I want to talk about pork barrel in a different sense. Well, there's a reason we have pork barrel, but let's go back. First of all, these are vetted, meaning that there'll be review panels to say what are the costs and benefits of these projects. How are the benefits fixed over certain numbers of categories? So they'll talk about benefits, whether environmental benefits, transportation benefits, economic development,
and equity considerations.
Equity always is part. I mean, that's written into every. It doesn't mean people pay attention to it, but they have to. And I think it's very critical. But you do a rational cost benefit, and one of the issues of cost benefit, of course, is you have to get the cost right. And part of the reason we've had so many overruns and why projects seem so expensive is around the country, around the globe, when people estimate project costs or tell you that we're going to build, for example, the XY bridge in Community Z for $20 million, and that's what's reported in the newspaper. Those of us who study transportation say it's going to be 30.
Yeah, right. And so there's a constant lowballing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you know what does
one
that
understands
do?
that.
What does that do? If you have 10 projects, let's say we'll talk about New York later, but if we have projects in New York or projects in California, 10 projects in California, and you've lowballed it, and this is your package of projects, when you begin to build them, you're going to find, hey, we don't have the money that we expected because they're all costing more. So I mean, we've sort of shifted into another gear, but part of the problem that our infrastructure costs so much is we've misestimated what we have, and we don't have the pool of capital coming in because we're competing with other pools of capital. But to get back to the infrastructure bank, so you have these projects that are there, and then the bill is very vague, but it says they can be subsidized by the government, and who knows whether it's a 50-50 or 80-20. Right. You don't know what 50-50.
And we know why it's vague.
Yeah. The government will issue bonds on behalf of the local area and pay the bonds. The government will loan money to the state, and they can issue bonds or a variety of things.
So it's flexible, and it sort of reflects and respects the federal system.
Exactly. It doesn't say how money is going to come back into it. It tells how money is coming out, but it's not clear unless the feds issue the debt that the money will come back in from tolls or taxes or something like that. But if it's a true bank, you have to have something revolving to bring the funds back in, and that's, I think we're all waiting to see what the source of that's going to be.
This infrastructure, investment in public infrastructure, not only creates jobs. You're talking about. I read somewhere for every X billions of dollars you create, X millions of jobs. 250 million. Billion creates 1 million new jobs, but also it generates economic activity throughout the system for goods and services, the so-called multiplier effect. So you're not only generating jobs, but you're really stimulating in the economy. And given the financial crisis that we're undergoing now, this seems like a no-brainer.
Well, if we learned our lessons from after the Depression, it should be a no-brainer. But let's just say building roads generates jobs in two ways. The first, it generates the construction jobs. But those are costs. You're paying people to build a road. Sure. So in one sense, if you weren't building the road, you wouldn't be paying them. So that's just putting people to work to do that. So the road has to do something. Transportation creates access. Energy creates access in a certain way, or creates locational advantages. Water the same way. So when you invest in infrastructure, what you're doing economically is you're creating a locational advantage for something. So you're providing incentives for people to locate or develop or create activities along where this is occurring, and that's the economic multiplier. You also get from the construction jobs, of course, you get. They go out and they take their money and they buy food and they have other things. So you're creating
get haircuts,
jobs.
buy shoes, right?
Not all of us get haircuts.
But some of us, I mean, you need them sometimes anyway.
I buy shoes.
Okay, so let's summarize for a moment. We've got a massive infrastructure deficit here. We don't have a coherent national or statewide policy. We've got this financial crisis. Make me a little optimistic here.
Well, here's I wish I could be really optimistic, but here's
fake it.
Here's what can be done, and here's traditionally what's done. What can be done is you can put in place long-term programs that transfer to when the what's called the highway bills, but the bills that fund our highways and bridges and public transit systems, the Surface Transportation Act, or a variety of those. Usually run 5 to 6 years. So you have continuity, and they authorize spending or spending limits over that period of time.
Right.
Now, we all know the difference between authorization and appropriation.
Yep.
And so you can have money authorized in the bill, but the money has to be appropriated every year, and you hope over the course of 6 years that the money will be appropriated. Now, Federal Highway has something called contract authority. So if they say if they enter into a contract with the state to spend certain funds, that money will be guaranteed. What you need is guaranteed continual sources of funding for long periods of time in order to build our infrastructure.
Excuse me. We have 30 seconds. We're going to get this continued expenditure of money?
We have to wait till after November 4th, I'm afraid.
And you think it's going to make a difference?
I think it absolutely will.
Okay. This has been the first of a two-part conversation with Professor Robert Paaswell on America's infrastructure. Next week, we're going to narrow our focus to New York and the New York region and focus particularly on your specialty, transportation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.